She watched him kill her. Julian Sterling, her boss's son, ran that woman down at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, looked in his rearview mirror, and drove away. No hesitation. No brake lights. Nothing. And when Haley reported it to the police the next morning, her boss smiled across his desk and said, "Careful, sweetheart. Nobody remembers a waitress who talks too much." The case was buried by noon. So Haley did the only thing left to do. She crashed the most dangerous man in the city's private gala, still in her waitress apron, walked straight past his armed guards, sat down across from Jimmy Voss, and said, "Your boss son did it. I watched him. And now they're going to kill me for it." The entire room went silent. Jimmy leaned forward slowly, his tattooed hands clasped, his eyes locked on hers, reading every word on her face. Then he said 4 words nobody expected. "You're under my protection." Subscribe to see what Jimmy does next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will personally say hello. The night it happened, Haley was on a double shift. Her feet ached the way they always did by R9, a deep, bone-level throbbing that started in her heels and climbed all the way up to the small of her back. She'd been clearing tables at the Sterling Room for 3 years. 3 years of yes sir and of course and of smiling through things that deserved a slap instead of a smile. The job paid her rent. She didn't have the luxury of dignity. It was 11:47 p.m. when she stepped out through the service exit into the alley to dump a bag of kitchen trash. The night air hit her like cold water, sharp, clean, a relief after hours of grease and perfume. She heard the engine first. Then the thud. Then silence so complete it felt like the whole city had flinched. She rounded the corner of the alley before her brain caught up to her feet and saw it, a woman face down in the street, one shoe knocked clean off her foot, a bouquet of grocery flowers scattered across the asphalt like something broken trying to be beautiful. And pulling away from the curb, moving slow and deliberate like he had all the time in the world, a black Range Rover with a custom plate she would spend the next 72 hours trying to forget. Just one. Julian Robert Sterling. Her boss's son. She knew that plate the way all the staff knew it. You learned to recognize it so you could have his table ready before he even walked through the door. You learned it so you could disappear before he noticed you and decided you were interesting. She stood frozen in the street while the woman's groceries bled out around her. A carton of orange juice cracked open, spreading across the road like something irreversible. And Julian Sterling's Range Rover turned the corner and was gone. Haley called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She gave her name. She gave the plate number. She told them exactly what she saw. The dispatcher told her to stay put and that someone was coming. No one came for 40 minutes. When they finally did, 2 officers arrived who looked uncomfortable in the way men look uncomfortable when they already know something they wish they didn't. They took her statement. They looked at each other once, just once, and that single look told Haley everything. She went home that night and couldn't sleep. She was back at work by 6 a.m. because she needed the shift. Her boss, Raymond Sterling, called her into his office at 9. He was standing behind his mahogany desk in a pressed white shirt, hands clasped behind his back, looking out the window at the city like he owned it. Which, Haley supposed, was because he nearly did. He didn't turn around when she entered. "I heard you spoke to the police last night," he said. She told him yes. She told him what she saw. The silence that followed lasted just long enough to feel like a warning. "Haley." He turned then, and his face was the face of a man performing patience. "You've been a good employee. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to change that." She opened her mouth. "The case," he said, cutting her off gently, "has already been ruled accidental. The woman had no identification. There were no other witnesses. He picked up his coffee cup. Careful, sweetheart. Nobody remembers a waitress who talks too much. By noon, she checked the news. The case was closed. By 3 p.m., 2 men she didn't recognize were sitting in a car outside her apartment building. By 7 p.m., Haley had made a decision that terrified her more than anything Raymond Sterling ever could. She was going to the gala. She didn't make it 20 minutes into Jimmy Voss's private event before his people had her by both arms and were walking her toward a side corridor with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. She didn't fight them. There was no point in fighting men like that. She just kept talking, fast, low, directly at the back of Jimmy's head as he walked ahead of her through a door she wasn't sure she'd be coming back out of. Julian Sterling killed a woman on Mercer Street 3 nights ago, and your people were already outside my apartment by sundown. Whatever she was to you, I saw it happen. I'm the only one who did. Jimmy Voss stopped walking. The corridor was quiet. Marble floors. A single painting on the wall worth more than her car. He stood with his back to her for 5 full seconds, and in those 5 seconds, Haley understood that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people. The ones who decided things, and the ones who waited to find out what had been decided about them. He turned around slowly. His eyes went to her apron. Then her face. Then somewhere behind her eyes, like he was reading something written further back than most people looked. What's your name? Haley. Haley what? Haley Burke. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, You didn't come here because you're brave. It wasn't a question. No, she admitted. You came because you're out of options. Yes. Something shifted in his face then, not softness exactly, but a recognition. Like he understood the particular kind of desperation that makes a person walk into a lion's den because the street outside has already caught fire. He nodded once to the men holding her arms and they released her immediately. You're not going back to your apartment tonight, he said. Or any night this week. Are you kidnapping me? I'm keeping you alive. He turned and walked. There's a difference. Keep up. The car that took them was black, quiet, and moved through the city like it knew every light cycle. They drove 40 minutes north to a neighborhood Haley had never been in, the kind where the houses sat so far back from the road you couldn't see them from the street. The safe house was clean and modern and looked like it belonged to someone who valued function over everything else. A woman named Petra, short, mid-40s, with the calm energy of someone who had seen genuine catastrophe and stopped being impressed by it, met them at the door and showed Haley to a room without a word of explanation. She slept in her work clothes. In the morning, Petra brought coffee and a change of clothes that fit almost exactly right, which unsettled Haley more than anything else had. Jimmy came at 9. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and didn't offer pleasantries. Tell me again, he said. Everything. She told him everything. The plate. The time. The way Julian had slowed down just slightly, just enough that she knew he'd seen, and then kept going. The way his father had smiled at her the next morning like a man who had already filed the paperwork on her silence. Jimmy listened without interrupting. His tattooed hands were flat on the table. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The woman, he finally said. Did she have anything on her? When you found her? Haley thought back. A bag. Some groceries. Flowers. Nothing else. She paused. There might have been a necklace. In the street. I didn't touch anything, the police. The police didn't log it, he said flatly, like this was a fact he'd already confirmed. He stood. You're staying here. Don't go outside. For how long? He stopped at the door. Until the Sterlings know that touching you would cost more than they're willing to spend. He made them understand 3 days later. Haley heard about it from Petra, who told her the way someone delivers a weather report, matter of fact, no editorial. One of the Sterling family's storage warehouses on the south side of Chicago had caught fire overnight. Not the kind of accidental fire that insurance companies believe in. The kind with a very specific point of origin and a very deliberate message burned into the loading dock door in the ash. 3 letters that everyone in the city's underworld could read. JV. By morning, it was on the local news as an industrial incident under investigation. By afternoon, Raymond Sterling had placed 4 additional men outside the Sterling room and pulled Julian out of his downtown apartment and into the family estate. Haley watched the coverage on the Safe House television with her knees pulled to her chest and something strange moving through her chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. She'd never had anyone do something like that for her before. She'd never been worth the kind of statement that gets made in fire. Jimmy came back that evening and said nothing about the warehouse. He sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee and asked her instead about Julian, about his patterns, his habits, the names she'd heard at those tables over 3 years of clearing his plates and pretending not to listen. She told him everything she'd absorbed without meaning to. Julian's Thursday card games. The name of the city councilman he texted from the private dining room. The shipping company he referenced every time he thought the staff was too far away to hear. Jimmy listened with his full attention in that particular way he had, not the performance of listening, but the real thing, the kind where you feel the weight of someone actually considering what you're saying. When she was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a moment. You've been collecting information for 3 years without knowing what to do with it, he said. I was just a waitress. You were a witness. His voice was even. There's no such thing as just anything. People who tell themselves that are usually protecting someone else's interests. She didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it for a long time after he left. On the 5th morning, Haley did the thing she'd been told not to do. She went back to Mercer Street. Not because she was reckless. Because something had been nagging at her since Jimmy asked about the necklace. A detail she'd filed away that night without understanding its weight. She told Petra she needed air and walked the 6 blocks before anyone could stop her, moving fast with her hood up and her heart doing something unreasonable in her chest. The street looked ordinary in daylight. The pavement was clean. There were no flowers, no evidence, no marker to suggest that something irreversible had happened here. The city had absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, without ceremony. But Haley stood at the spot and looked at the gutter and saw the glint. It was pressed against the base of the curb, half hidden under a film of street grime, and she almost missed it. A necklace. Thin gold chain, broken clean through, snapped in the accident or the fall. And hanging from what remained of the chain, a small circular pendant no bigger than a quarter. She picked it up with shaking hands. Turned it over. On the back, engraved in letters so small she had to squint. For V, always. J. She stood there on Mercer Street in the cold morning air and felt the specific, terrible sensation of a puzzle piece dropping into a place you didn't know was empty. She was still standing there when Jimmy's car pulled up to the curb. Because of course Petra had called him the moment she'd left, and he got out without urgency, walked to where she stood, and she held the necklace out to him without a word. He took it. Looked at it. And for the first time since she'd met him, Haley watched something break open behind his eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough to be real. Where did you find this? The gutter. It was there the whole time. His jaw tightened. His hand closed around the necklace slowly, the chain disappearing into his tattooed fist. When he looked up at her, his eyes had gone somewhere deep and locked down, the look of a man absorbing something catastrophic and choosing, in real time, not to collapse under it. Her name was Vivian, he said quietly. She was 26. She was my sister. The street was silent around them. Hayley felt the weight of it settle over her like something permanent, the understanding that she hadn't just witnessed a crime. She had witnessed the thing that was going to burn Raymond Sterling's entire world to the ground. And she was the only person left alive who could prove it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Whatever you need me to do." Jimmy looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the car door. "Get in," he said. "We need to move. They know you left the house." The attack came at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. Hayley was awake. She hadn't been sleeping well, hadn't since Mercer Street, hadn't since learning that the woman in the road had a name and that name was Vivian and that she had a brother who wore his grief like armor welded directly to his bones. She was sitting at the kitchen window with a glass of water when she saw the first shadow move wrong along the tree line at the edge of the property. She'd lived her whole life in cities. She knew how shadows moved. She was on her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to move, crossing the hallway in 3 steps, pressing herself against the wall outside Jimmy's door and knocking hard. Not a polite knock, the kind that means right now. He opened the door in 4 seconds. Already awake, already reading her face. She didn't say anything. Just pointed toward the east side of the house. He understood immediately. He was already moving, one hand on her arm, pulling her away from the windows. When the first sound of breaking glass came from the back of the estate, followed almost instantly by the controlled chaos of his security team engaging with something they'd been waiting for. The next 8 minutes were the longest of Hayley's life. Jimmy kept her in the interior hallway, the one room with no exterior walls, his body positioned between her and every door. She could hear the firefight moving around the outside of the house, organized and brutal, his men responding with the efficiency of people who trained for exactly this. But there was one who got through. She heard him before she saw him, the soft sound of the side door being forced with something that knew what it was doing, and she reacted on pure instinct. The emergency cabinet at the end of the hallway had been pointed out to her on day 1 by Petra, the way you point out fire exits to someone who's staying in your home. She crossed to it in 4 steps, pulled the handle, and had the flare gun in her hands by the time the door swung open. She didn't hesitate. The flare hit the far wall and through the hallway into blinding orange light, and the man who came through the door stumbled backward, blinded and disoriented, and by the time he found his footing, 2 of Jimmy's security team had him from behind. The house went quiet. Then it stayed quiet. Jimmy turned around and looked at her, at the flare gun still in her hands, at the controlled adrenaline moving through her face, and said nothing for a long moment. "You were watching the tree line," he said finally. "I couldn't sleep. That's twice now you've seen something before my people did." She set the flare gun down carefully. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. "He sent a professional," she said. "This isn't just about keeping me quiet anymore. He's coming for you now too." Jimmy's expression didn't change. But something behind it did, a decision being made in real time, something tipping past a point of no return. "Then we stop waiting," he said. He crossed to the hallway table and picked up his phone. "The Underworld Gala is in 4 days. You're going as my associate." He looked at her steadily. "And we're going to find Julian Sterling in a room full of witnesses and make sure he can never hide behind his father's name again." Haley looked at him across the wreckage of the night. The broken glass, the orange-scorched wall, the life she'd had 3 weeks ago already so far gone it felt like someone else's story. "I'll need a dress," she said. Something moved at the corner of Jimmy's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. "Petra will handle it," he said. And somewhere in the city, Raymond Sterling sat in his estate and thought he had won another night. He had no idea what was coming. The dress was deep burgundy. Not the kind of red that announces itself, the kind that lets you walk into a room and make people feel like they chose to look at you. Petra had laid it out on the bed without comment, along with a pair of heels that cost more than Haley's monthly grocery budget and a thin gold bracelet that she put on and then couldn't stop looking at because it reminded her of the broken chain she'd pulled from a gutter on Mercer Street. She thought about Vivienne the whole time she got ready. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was held in the Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Chicago, the kind of venue that made you feel underdressed just by existing near it. Crystal chandeliers that probably had names. Waitstaff in white gloves. A guest list that read like a directory of everyone in the city who had decided the rules were for other people. Jimmy met her at the car door. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register, not long enough to comment, and then offered his arm like this was something they did regularly. She took it because she had no other choice, and they walked into the light together. Inside, he leaned close enough that she could hear him clearly without anyone else catching a word. "You're not looking for Julian. You're looking for the way Julian looks at a room. He'll scan every entrance. He's been nervous since the warehouse. Watch his eyes, not his face." She understood. 3 years of reading tables had taught her the same thing. You don't learn people from what they show you. You learn them from what they're watching for. They moved through the room the way Jimmy moved through every room, with a quiet gravitational pull that made people shift and adjust without quite knowing why. Senators acknowledged him with nods they tried to make look casual. A federal judge found something interesting to study on the far wall the moment they passed. Haley kept her face pleasant and her eyes working. She found Julian in 40 minutes. He was standing near the bar at the east end of the room, holding a glass of something amber and doing exactly what Jimmy said he'd do. Scanning every door, every face, every point of entry with the tight, compulsive energy of a man who had stopped feeling safe in public spaces. He was younger than she'd remembered him looking from across a dining room. Sharper around the eyes. The kind of handsome that would have worked on her once, back when she was the kind of person who couldn't afford to look too closely at the people writing her paychecks. She pressed her hand gently against Jimmy's forearm, their prearranged signal. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at her. "East Bar," she said quietly. "Blue tie. He's been watching the main entrance for the last 10 minutes. Jimmy's hand covered hers on his arm for just a moment. Not a gesture of romance, a gesture of confirmation. "Good. Don't look at him again," he said. "We have what we came for." They stayed another hour. They danced once, slow, formal, the kind of dancing that's really just 2 people exchanging information through proximity. And Jimmy told her quietly that his team had identified 2 of Sterling's men in the catering staff and had already handled it. When they left, Julian Sterling was still at the East Bar, still watching the door, still waiting for a threat that had already been standing 20 feet away and taken everything it needed. In the car, Jimmy made 3 calls. Short. Specific. The kind of calls where you don't need to say much because the people on the other end already know their jobs. When he hung up, Haley looked out the window at the city going by, lit up and indifferent and full of people who had no idea what was moving underneath it, and felt the gala pulling away behind her like a held breath finally released. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Jimmy said, "we tighten the circle. Raymond Sterling came to her. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected another hired car in a dark street, another anonymous threat delivered through someone else's hands. She hadn't expected him to walk through the front door of the coffee shop 2 blocks from the safe house on a Thursday morning like a man who had nothing left to be careful about. She saw him before he saw her, and the instinct was immediate: run, but she was already sitting down and the door was already closing behind him, and there was a man outside the window she recognized from the gala's catering staff, which meant this wasn't an accident, and running would only prove she was alone. She stayed in her seat. Raymond Sterling sat down across from her like they were continuing a meeting that had only briefly been interrupted. He looked the same as he always had behind his mahogany desk, controlled, patient, performing calm the way powerful men perform calm when they want you to understand that your panic is a choice they find vaguely disappointing. He ordered coffee. He waited until it arrived. "You've made some interesting friends," he said. She didn't answer. "Jimmy Voss is a very impressive man," he continued, wrapping both hands around his cup. "But impressive men have complicated interests. And complicated interests have a way of shifting." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to think about what happens when his interest in you shifts, Haley. When you stop being useful. When the next problem lands on his desk and you're just a waitress with a story that can't be proven." "I have the necklace," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. She filed it away. A necklace with no chain of custody, no legal documentation, no name attached to the victim who conveniently had no identification on her. He tilted his head. "My lawyers have built cases against better evidence than that. Your lawyers are paid for by money that Jimmy Voss knows how to trace." The silence lasted 3 seconds. "Your mother," he said, "still lives in Evanston. I believe your younger brother is finishing his last year at DePaul." He said it the way people say the weather, informational, casual, stripped of all the violence that was actually inside it. A woman alone can make difficult choices. A woman protecting her family makes different ones. Haley felt the cold move through her like water through a cracked foundation, slow and complete and settling into every space it could find. She looked at Raymond Sterling and understood in that moment that this was not a negotiation. This was a demonstration. He was showing her the size of what he was willing to do. She also understood something else. He wouldn't have come here himself, wouldn't have sat down across from her in a public coffee shop and said her brother's name out loud, if he wasn't scared. Scared men don't send messages through hired hands. Scared men come themselves because they need to see your face when the message lands. She looked him directly in the eyes. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once, satisfied with the performance of her fear. He left the coffee without finishing it. The moment he was through the door, she had her phone out. She had Jimmy's number memorized. Petra had made her memorize it the first night, the way you memorize a fire exit. He picked up on the second ring. "He came to me," she said. "In person. He threatened my family." A beat of silence on the other end that felt like something being decided. "How long ago did he leave?" 40 seconds. "Go back to the safe house. Don't walk. Take the first car you see at the corner, the driver knows you." Another pause. "And Haley?" "Yeah. Your family is already being moved. It happened this morning." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Just one." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "We have a problem." The problem had a name. It was Derek Yount, Jimmy's lieutenant of 7 years, the man who ran the North Side operations and sat at the left-hand side of every meeting and had built such a complete architecture of loyalty that no one had thought to look at him until the evidence was already undeniable. Jimmy laid it out for her that evening at the safe house kitchen table with the flatness of a man performing a surgery on himself. Precise, necessary, refusing to flinch. A location ping had gone out from the Safe House network 6 hours before Raymond Sterling walked into that coffee shop. The ping had gone to a number registered to a shell company that traced back, 3 layers deep, to the Sterling Group's legal fund. Derek had sold her location. He had probably been selling information for weeks. Maybe longer. Haley sat with that for a moment. Does he know you know? Not yet. What are you going to do? Jimmy was quiet for a beat. Let him make one more move. I want to know everything Sterling is planning before I close the door. It was the right call strategically. She understood that. It didn't make the next 36 hours feel any less like standing on glass. They moved her again, deeper, further north, a location only 3 people knew. Petra stayed with her. Jimmy stayed operational, feeding Derek just enough information to keep the line of communication to Sterling active and just enough false detail to redirect what was coming. What was coming arrived at 4 a.m. on a Friday. She heard the vehicles first, multiple, coordinated, the specific sound of men who had been told this would be easy. Sterling's people had come in numbers because they'd been told the security was thin. Because Derek had told them. Because Jimmy had let Derek tell them. What they hadn't been told was that Jimmy was already there. The shipyard was Sterling's contingency. His legal team had arranged it months ago, a fallback location on the south waterfront where certain problems could be resolved outside the geography of accountability. Raymond had been moving toward it for days, pulling his assets tighter, pulling Julian closer, preparing the kind of exit that powerful men prepare when they feel the walls beginning to move. He didn't get to use it the way he'd planned. Jimmy's team hit from 3 sides simultaneously: water, road, and the eastern gate that Sterling's people had been told was unwatched. Haley was in the second vehicle, which she had argued about and lost, because Jimmy had looked at her and said, "You're the witness. You're the reason this ends legally. I need you breathing," and she hadn't had a response to that. She heard the shipyard before she saw it. The sound of a firefight at close range is nothing like the movies. It's sharp and disorienting, and it bounces off metal and water in ways that make direction feel unreliable. She stayed in the vehicle with Petra until the radio crackled and a voice said, "East is clear," and then Petra looked at her and said, "Now," and they moved. The shipyard was chaos resolving itself into order. Jimmy's men in controlled positions, Sterling's hired hands in various states of surrender and worse. She moved through it with her head down and her heart doing something she'd deal with later, following Petra's hand on her arm like a compass. She found Julian Sterling in a shipping container near the water's edge. Not hiding. Cornered. There's a difference. He was standing with his back to the corrugated wall with nowhere left to perform the version of himself that Daddy's money had always made possible, and when he saw Haley walk through that door he went through 3 expressions so fast she could read them all: recognition, then contempt, then something that looked very close to fear. "You," he said. "Me," she said. She had nothing else to say to him. She didn't need to. She stepped back and let Jimmy's men move in, and she didn't look away while they put Julian Sterling in zip ties and walked him out of that container and into a future his father's lawyers were not going to be able to buy him out of. Raymond Sterling was found in the shipyard office with a phone in his hand and no signal, and the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the architecture of his life has been dismantled in a single night. He didn't fight. Men like Raymond Sterling never fight with their hands. They fight with paperwork and influence and the comfortable distance of people hired to fight on their behalf. Without those things, he was just an old man in a pressed shirt with no phone signal and nowhere to go. Jimmy walked him out personally. Haley stood at the edge of the shipyard and watched it happen, watched the Sterling name get walked out of the darkness in zip ties, and felt something inside her that had been wound tight for 3 weeks slowly, deliberately release. The city skyline was turning grey at the edges. Somewhere behind it, the sun was making its decision. She thought about Vivienne. She thought about a bouquet of grocery store flowers scattered across wet asphalt on a Tuesday night. She thought about orange juice spreading irreversibly across the road and a woman's shoe knocked clean off her foot. She thought about what it meant that a woman could die on an empty street and the whole city could look away in under 12 hours. She thought about the fact that it hadn't stayed away. Jimmy came to stand beside her after Raymond was secured. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the water. She looked at the water. "It's over?" she asked. "The hard part," he said. 3 weeks later, a file landed on the desk of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago that contained enough documentation to dismantle 4 years of legal immunity. 2 city contracts awarded through fraud, 1 bought and paid for police captain, and the full financial architecture of the Sterling Group's political protection network. The file had been assembled by people whose names would never appear in the case record. It was impeccable. It was airtight. Every page was a door that couldn't be closed again once it was opened. Julian Sterling was charged on the 3rd day. Hit and run resulting in death. Leaving the scene. Obstruction. The kind of charges that don't get pleaded down when the evidence is assembled by someone who knows exactly how to make evidence impossible to argue with. Raymond Sterling was charged on the 5th. The family's lawyers arrived in formation and found themselves holding paperwork that had already anticipated every argument they came prepared to make. Haley heard later from Petra that Raymond had asked to speak to Jimmy directly and that Jimmy had declined on the grounds that he had nothing to say to him. She understood that completely. The immunity burn happened quietly, the way the most permanent things tend to happen. 2 city council members who had been on the Sterling payroll resigned within the same week, citing personal reasons, in the careful way people cite personal reasons when the alternative has been made very clear to them. The police captain took early retirement. The mayor's office issued a statement about renewed commitment to transparency that everyone in the city read the way people read statements about renewed commitment to transparency. It wasn't justice the way Haley had grown up understanding the word. It was justice the way the city actually worked. Structural, unseeable, pressure applied to the right points in the right order until the whole thing shifted. She was still deciding how she felt about that. What she was not still deciding about was the morning 2 weeks after the shipyard when Jimmy drove her to a building on West Randolph Street, a corner location with big windows and a black awning and a sign above the door that read the Sterling Room in gold lettering that was already in the process of being taken down by 2 men on a scaffold. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it. "This is my place of work," she said. "Was," Jimmy said. "What's happening to it?" He reached into his jacket and produced a single document, folded in thirds. He held it out to her. She took it. Opened it slowly. Read the first paragraph. Read the second. Read the part where her name appeared in clean legal type as the silent owner of the premises and operating license, held through a property trust that the Sterling family no longer had any claim to. She read it twice to make sure she understood it right. "You can't," she started. "It's already done. Jimmy. You have 3 years of knowledge about how that place runs." His voice was even, practical, stripped of anything that would make this hard to accept. "You know every vendor, every supplier, Every staff member worth keeping. You know what works and what was only there to serve the Sterlings. He looked at the building. I have zero interest in running a restaurant. I have significant interest in the building. The license is yours. She looked down at the document in her hands. At her name in clean black type. At the address of the place where she had cleared tables for 3 years and been called sweetheart by a man who thought her silence was something he could purchase. She thought about what Jimmy had said to her in the safe house kitchen. People who tell themselves they're just anything are usually protecting someone else's interests. She folded the document carefully and held it against her chest the way she'd held her hands at the gala, but different now. Not defensive. Not protecting a secret. Holding something that was finally, irrevocably hers. Above them on the scaffold, the last letter of the old sign came down. What are you going to call it? Jimmy asked. She looked at the clean black space where the gold lettering had been. She thought about a thin gold chain with a broken clasp. She thought about a pendant no bigger than a quarter and 4 words engraved in letters small enough to miss if you weren't looking. Vivienne's, she said. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. When she looked at him, his jaw was tight in the way it got when something was moving behind his eyes that he wasn't ready to name out loud. He nodded once, slowly, with the full weight of someone who means it in every layer of themselves. He looked up at the empty awning. She looked up with him. And somewhere in the city on a Thursday morning, the sun came all the way up, and the Sterling name finished its last day on that building, and a waitress who had once been told she didn't matter stood on a sidewalk with her name on a deed and understood for the first time in her life exactly how wrong they had been. And that is how the story ends. But only if you were here for it. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of what Haley fought through, subscribe, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that don't get told loudly enough. We give the waitresses the ending they deserve. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I will personally say hello to you. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Because Haley made it out. And so will you.